here at WashingtonPost.com. And the story is entitled, Did Historical Jesus Really Exist? The evidence just does not add up. There are clearly good reasons to doubt Jesus' historical existence. By Raphael Lataster. And Raphael begins, Did a man called Jesus of Nazareth walk the earth? Discussions over whether the figure known as the historical Jesus actually existed primarily reflect disagreements among atheists, believers who uphold the implausible and more easily dismissed Christ of faith, the divine Jesus who walked on water, ought not to get involved. Numerous secular scholars have presented their own versions of the so-called historical Jesus. And most of them are, as biblical scholar J.D. Crossan puts it, an academic embarrassment. From Crossan's view of Jesus as the wise sage, to Robert Eisenman's Jesus the revolutionary, and Bar Ehrman's apocalyptic prophet, about the only thing New Testament scholars seem to agree on is Jesus' historical existence. But can even that be questioned? The first problem we encounter when trying to discover more about the historical Jesus is the lack of early sources. The earliest sources only reference the clearly fictional Christ of faith. These early sources, compiled decades after the alleged events, all stem from Christian authors eager to promote Christianity, which gives us reason to question them. The authors of the Gospels fail to name themselves, well, most of them do, describe their qualifications, or show any criticism with their foundational sources, which they also fail to identify. Filled with mythical and non-historical information, and heavily edited over time, the Gospels certainly should not convince critics to trust even the more mundane claims made therein. The author writes, The methods traditionally used to tease out rare nuggets of truth from the Gospels are dubious. I don't know about that. The criterion of embarrassment says that if a section would be embarrassing for the author, it is more likely authentic. That I agree with. Unfortunately, given the diverse nature of Christianity and Judaism back then, and things have not changed all that much, and the anonymity of the authors, it is impossible to determine what truly would be embarrassing or counterintuitive, let alone if that might not serve some evangelistic purpose. I don't think he exactly grasped that criterion, but the criterion of Aramaic context is similarly unhelpful. Jesus and his closest followers were surely not the only Aramaic speakers in first-century Judea. The criterion of multiple independent attestation can also hardly be used properly here, given that the sources clearly are not independent. Paul's epistles, which were written earlier than the Gospels, give us no reason to dogmatically declare Jesus must have existed. Avoiding Jesus' earthly events and teachings, even when the latter could have bolstered his own claims, Paul only describes his heavenly Jesus. Even when discussing what appear to be the resurrection and the Last Supper, his only stated sources are his direct revelations from the Lord and his indirect revelations from the Old Testament. In fact, Paul actually rules out human sources. That from Galatians. Also important are sources we don't have. There are no existing eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus. All we have are later descriptions of his life events by non-eyewitnesses, most of whom are obviously biased. Little can be gleaned from the few non-biblical and non-Christian sources, with only the Roman scholar Josephus and historian Tacitus having any reasonable claim to be writing about Jesus within 100 years of his life. And even those sparse accounts are shrouded in controversy, with disagreements over what parts have obviously been changed by Christian scribes. The manuscripts were preserved by Christians. The fact that both these authors were born after Jesus died, they would thus have probably received this information from Christians, and the oddity that centuries go by before Christian apologists start referencing them. Agnosticism over the matter is already seemingly appropriate, according to the author. And support for this position comes from the independent historian Richard Carrier's recent defense of another theory, namely that the belief in Jesus started as the belief in a purely celestial being who was killed by demons in an upper realm, who became historicized over time. To summarize his 800-page tome, this theory and the traditional theory that Jesus was a historical figure who became mythicized over time both align well with the Gospels, which are later mixtures of obvious myth and what at least sounds historical. This guy doesn't have very much respect for the Bible as a source. The Pauline epistles, however, overwhelmingly support the celestial Jesus theory, particularly with the passage indicating that demons killed Jesus and would not have done so if they knew who he was. That from Corinthians. Humans, the murderers according to the Gospels, of course would still have killed Jesus, knowing full well that his death results in their salvation and the defeat of the evil spirits. So what do the mainstream and non-Christian scholars say about all of this? Surprisingly very little. Of substance, anyway. Only Bart Ehrman and Morris Casey have thoroughly attempted to prove Jesus' historical existence in recent times. Their most decisive point? The Gospels can generally be trusted, after we ignore the many, many bits that are untrustworthy, because of the hypothetical, that is to say, non-existent sources behind them. Who produced these hypothetical sources? And when? And what did they say? Were they reliable? Were they intended to be accurate historical portrayals, enlightening allegories, or entertaining fictions? Ehrman and Casey can't tell you, and neither can any New Testament scholar, given the poor state of the existing sources and the atrocious methods used by mainstream biblical historians. The matter will likely never be resolved, and there are clearly good reasons to doubt Jesus' historical existence, if not to think it outright improbable. Yeah, this guy doesn't seem to have very much respect for biblical researchers at all. Yeah, I think this is a little bit of a slanted article.